Remarkable works of Edward Taylor's Huswifery and Anne Bradstreet's Upon the Burning of Our House. Last week, I asked you to do a poetry analysis of both the poems. So today, we'll analyze how these poems reflect Puritan values and beliefs and how their literary devices help convey spiritual meaning. So, by the end of this presentation, you will be able to identify and analyze Puritan values and beliefs in literature, and we will focus on how these ideas are expressed through, of course, figurative language, tone, and poetic devices in Taylor's and Bradstreet's works. So, let's recall what are the core beliefs of Puritanism. The first one is, of course, absolute sovereignty. God is the supreme ruler of all. We have learned in our previous discussion that the Puritans upholds God out of all things, and it's the basis of how they live their lives. Um, in the poem, we will also look at how they view the earth. So, temporary earth, life on earth is brief, and the goal is, of course, eternal life. We will also see how diligence is a spiritual duty in one of the poems. And we will also see how poetry serves to glorify God and not for entertainment. We will be using these poetic devices to understand the Puritan beliefs in huswifery and upon the burning of our house. So we've learned about conceit, which is an elaborate, highly intellectual metaphor that compares two very different things. And of course, we have metaphor, a direct comparison of two unlike things without using like or as. Symbolism, using concrete objects to represent abstract ideas. And we've also talked about how allusion works, a reference to a well known person, place, event, or literary work, or in this case, the Bible. So let's start with huswifery. What is the meaning of the word huswifery? So, huswifery is the business of a housewife. It's a traditional female domestic economy and skill. So, huswifery is just another word for housework or a household chore. Taylor's huswifery uses spiritual metaphor, wherein he compared the process of making cloth to the speaker's spiritual transformation. While for Anne Bradstreet's poem, Verses Upon the Burning of Our House, the poem was written in response to the real life destruction of Bradstreet's home in Andover, Massachusetts, which burned to the ground in 1666. So it is a poem about how she spiritually processes that loss through Puritan faith. Let's talk about the persona and the addressee in both the poems. So when we say persona, this is the speaker or the description of the character that speaks in the poem. And when we say addressee, this is the intended audience. So who is the persona speaking to in the poem? As we read huswifery through his word choices, his diction, we feel that the persona is a speaker that desires to be sanctified and be glorified. He longs to be transformed for divine purposes. He also implied that he cannot achieve this through his own, and he needs God's intervention, that he needs God all throughout this process. And upon the burning of our house, the speaker is, of course, a devout Puritan, a Christian that struggled between grief and spiritual submission. So, the speaker, of course, as we read the poem, chose to surrender everything to God. Now, who is the addressee? Who is the one being spoken to in huswifery. So obviously, the poem is addressing God, or the speaker is addressing God. We feel that the whole poem is like a prayer for for spiritual transformation. While upon the burning of our house, the addressee, or well, the speaker is actually speaking to herself. So she is kind of reflecting upon her situation, upon her struggle, but in the process of reflecting, she's also addressing God. What are some key lines in huswifery that show us the Puritan values and beliefs? The first few lines: Make me, O Lord, thy spinning wheel complete, thy holy word my distaff make for me. And some of the succeeding lines: Make mine affections thy swift flyers neat, then make my soul thy holy spool to be, shows us that the speaker is fully submitting to God. He is willing to be used as an instrument, like a spinning wheel, to transform something into something beautiful and is glorifying God. But in the act of submission, we can sense his humility, that he recognizes that he cannot do it himself. He recognizes that he is limited as a human being. So if we read this line, then weave the web thyself, yourself. The yarn is fine. So the speaker is comparing himself to a yarn that is fine. When we say fine, it's not like fine that he is very well, that he is perfect. The yarn is fine here means that he is very weak, very vulnerable, and that he needs God to weave him because he is vulnerable. We can also sense his desire all throughout the poem to be transformed or to be purified. Then clothe therewith mine understanding, will, affections, judgment, conscience, memory. So he wants everything about himself to be transformed. And why does he want to be purified? Or why does he want to be transformed? Because his desire is to be worthy of God's salvation, or to be glorified. So if we look at the last two lines of the poem, then mine apparel shall display before ye, that I am clothed in holy robes for glory. So the whole poem is like a prayer to be transformed, a person that is worthy of being glorified or worthy of being saved. In the poem, Edward Taylor recognizes that he is human, and he submits to God so that he can be transformed. And as a Puritan, it's important in every day of their lives to be worthy of God's grace and worthy of salvation. Now, what are the key excerpts in Upon the Burning of Our House? As we have read the poem, we can sense that throughout this scenario, we have learned how Anne Bradstreet processed the whole or the entire ordeal of her house burning. So, if we look at the first few lines, lines number 1 to 6, so this was her first reaction. She was shocked. And of course, she was very much afraid of the whole thing, her house being on fire in that night while she was sleeping. Now, in the succeeding lines, we can see her first response. So she cried to God in prayer. So if we look at lines 8, 9, and 10, after her shock and her fear, she cried to the Lord in prayer. She asked to straighten her, so to not make her feel helpless during that time of her struggle. We read that she acknowledged, she she started acknowledging, you know, the loss of her possessions, the loss of her house, and everything that is in it. When she could no longer look, she blessed his name that gave and took. So we can already sense the poetic devices here. His name that gave and took. So he acknowledges that God gave everything, and he also has the power to take everything. Now the next lines of the poem shows Anne Bradstreet's humanity, where if you remember, Anne Bradstreet is well known to put her personal reflections, to put her personal emotions in her work. So if you look at the succeeding lines from lines 15 to 35, so please follow along. And I hope this is what you've also written in your analysis. She was honest. She was honest with what she felt. She grieved for everything that she has lost. She remembered all her things in the house, the way she used it before, and that she can no longer use it. But as she has the struggle, of mourning for the loss of her possessions, she always corrects herself spiritually. She reminds herself about the scriptures. And as we all know, there's a lot of lines here that shows biblical allusions. So she uses a lot of verses from the Bible to remind herself of what she has to feel and what she has to do despite her loss. And as we read um, the last few parts of her poem, the things that are spiritual. So when she said, adieu, adieu, all's vanity. So we can sense here that she fully surrendered everything, that she accepted, and that she acknowledges that everything in our lives is uh, useless if we remember your vocabulary, that we don't really need these earthly things. And what's important is, of course, the last line. Her hope and her treasure lies above. So when we say above, so this is an allusion to heaven and God, to be with God, to be in His everlasting grace. So, talking about poetic devices, huswifery uses conceit. So, the entire poem is an example of a classic metaphysical conceit, complex, sustained, and intellectually structured. So, as we can see here, the poem uses one image, and it's the image of making cloth or spinning cloth to show the process of spiritual growth, and the spinning process represents becoming closer to God. The poem then proceeds to compare the process of spinning to the process of spiritual transformation and becoming glorified. So, as we see from all the lines in Huswifery, it uses a lot of metaphors. God being the divine craftsman, the speaker, which is the spinning wheel, yarn, which is his faith, loom is the life, cloth is the character of being holy, and the finished garment being the glorified soul. While in Upon the Burning of Our House, there's a lot of biblical allusion. So all throughout her poem, explicitly alludes to the Bible scriptures. We know that we're not that familiar of the verses in the Bible, but as we can sense through her word choices, her word choices reflects the things that she has learned in her faith. So it was his own, it was not mine. So his being, it's God's, not hers. House on high erect, and my hope and treasure lies above. So it's all coming from biblical scriptures. And when everything turned to dust, ashes, it represents our mortality, that life is very temporary. And we should look at our heavenly house. So the heavenly house symbolizes eternal salvation through the mighty architect, which is God. The lines adieu, os vanity. So the earthly house represents vanity, temporary, uselessness of life. And a house on high erect, framed by the mighty architect, symbolizes or is a metaphor for the heavenly house or eternal salvation. So, what are the themes in Puritan poetry? So, for huswifery emphasizes the importance of aligning personal action with God's will, highlighting the significance of spiritual devotion in daily life. And we have a universal desire for purpose and for meaningful connection with something greater than ourselves. It also shows us that everyday labor could be sacred and can be glorifying God. And also, Taylor reminds us through his poem that we are instruments of God. What about in Upon the Burning of Our House? We have learned the themes of temporary or earthly things versus the spiritual things. So, material loss is painful, but faith must overcome grief. So, it teaches us how to respond to loss and grief. It also reminds us through the poem that our material possessions are not eternal, that it can easily be turned to ashes, that we can just easily lose them. But what's more important is, of course, salvation and spiritual purity. Uh, the Puritans teaches us that it's more important to look at the things that are above and that we should not be focusing on the earthly things because it's temporary. And what's important are the things that are eternal. So our true treasure is in heaven. So both poems teach that God controls all things, earthly life is temporary, and spiritual purity matters more than possessions. Suffering and labor are tools to be sanctified. So, what have we learned from the Puritan poetry? It's moral and religious teachings in verses. So, I hope we have the same answers. For your exit ticket, I want you to read the following questions and write your answers on your prompt notebooks. So, thank you for your attention.